we're examining 12 historical facts about the end of Jesus' life that are accepted by all critical scholars. And we want to answer the question, does historical evidence lead to the conclusion that Jesus really rose from the dead? Philosopher Dr. William Lane Craig presents the evidence for this fact.
These four facts, the honorable burial of Jesus, the discovery of his empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and the origin of the disciples' faith that God had raised Jesus from the dead, represent the views of the majority of New Testament critics who have written on these subjects. And I want to emphasize, I'm not talking here about conservative scholars or fundamentalists. I'm talking about the broad mainstream of scholarship. Those who deny it tend to be radical critics on the left-wing fringe of New Testament scholarship. But the majority of scholars who have written on these subjects agree with the honorable burial, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' faith in the resurrection of Jesus. Now, specifically with regard to the empty tomb, the majority of scholars who have written on this subject agree that the tomb of Jesus was probably found empty by a group of his women followers early on Sunday morning. That represents the historical core of the empty tomb narrative as we find it in Mark.
Why do they find it credible?
The empty tomb story enjoys multiple independent lines of evidence. For example, as I've already indicated, the burial account supports the empty tomb story. If the burial account of Jesus is historically accurate, then the inference that the tomb was found empty is not very far at hand, because the resurrection faith could not have arisen and flourished in the face of a closed tomb. Secondly, I think that the empty tomb story is also multiply and independently attested in early sources. It's attested in the pre-Markan Passion source, that is the source that Mark used for writing his Gospels. But we also have independent sources for the empty tomb in Matthew and Luke, and also in John. This is evident, for example, from the fact that Matthew has a quite different account of the empty tomb, employing the idea of a guard story, which Matthew did not invent out of whole cloth, but which represented a tradition which Matthew received. Most scholars recognize that John's account of the empty tomb and the burial of Jesus is independent of the three synoptic Gospels. I also think that the empty tomb is implied, at least, in the formula handed on by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. When you look at the third line of that formula, which says, "And he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures," that third line corresponds to the empty tomb narrative in the Gospels and to the empty tomb in the sermons in the Acts of the Apostles. So again, it is a summary, an outline form of the wider story of the empty tomb.
Now, the early historical accounts about Jesus' life say it was women who were the first to discover the fact that Jesus' tomb was empty. Dr. William Lane Craig explains why, if a writer was inventing the story about Jesus, he would not have named women as the early witnesses of the empty tomb. Listen.
Another earmark of the historical credibility of the empty tomb story is the surprising fact that the tomb was discovered empty by women. Now, in order to appreciate why this is remarkable, you need to understand two things about the role of women in first century Jewish society. First of all, women were, quite frankly, second-class citizens. For example, one later rabbinic saying says, "Blessed is he whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female." This was clearly the era of pre-feminist consciousness. Secondly, the testimony of women was regarded as so unreliable that they were not even allowed to serve as witnesses in a Jewish court of law. Now, in light of this fact, how remarkable must it seem that it is women who are the chief witnesses to and the discoverers of Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples, say Peter and John, come to the tomb first and discover it empty. The fact that it is discovered empty by women whose testimony in that society was regarded as worthless is most plausibly explained by saying that, like it or not, they were the discoverers of the empty tomb. And the Gospels record what for them was a very embarrassing and awkward fact.
Number one, if you're explaining the gospel accounts and you want to make a great preaching point, again, don't pick the women as your first witnesses, because you don't accept them, as Luke 24:11 says. Your audience doesn't accept them, so why put them out there unless Jesus really appeared to them? So the testimony of the women is important. Number two, the empty tomb was preached very early. You've got Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 saying, he died, he was buried, what went down is what came out, and what came out is what appeared. You've got the fact that this was proclaimed in Jerusalem. And I got to say, if you're going to proclaim the resurrection and you want to start with the empty tomb, and by the way, they didn't start with that. I mean, the appearances are much more important. But I said you don't use women, and you don't want to proclaim early if at all possible. You want to let it go a little bit, and they don't. But thirdly, don't do it in Jerusalem. That's the place where it can be disproven. Because if the Jewish leaders or Romans were to get that body out, now some critics say, well, what would that body look like in 50 days? Still, look, they say, hey, fellas, here's the garment is still on him. He's crucified. Look, boys, what do you say about this? So Jerusalem's the wrong place to do it. So here's some of the data we have just to start with there that say that that tomb was empty. Here's the location. Here's the women. Here's the early sources. I think we've got a good start there in the resurrection preaching.